2 a.m. Welcome back to the 2 a.m. Book Review Club, where we stay up late talking about books or talk about books that made us stay up late. As you all know, I read a lot of books, and generally speaking, when I finish a book, I am already kind of forgetting about it because I'm so ready to move on to the next book. But there are definitely times when, even when I've moved on to a new book, I'm still thinking about the previous book. And that can be for a variety of reasons. Sometimes I read a book and it's so good that I can't stop thinking about it. I'm like, that book was so incredible and I can't believe it exists and I got to read it. And then sometimes I'm like, I cannot stop thinking about this book because it was just that awful and I cannot believe it exists and I can't believe I got tricked into reading it. But then sometimes I read a book like today's book, which is The Historian by Elizabeth Kostova. And it's like, I can't stop thinking about this book because I read every single page of this 700-page book, and yet I still don't know how to feel about it, which is kind of strange because The Historian is this really big, really complex book that tends to generate a lot of strong feelings. A lot of people love it. A lot of people hate it, and I do think that makes sense because I think it is hard not to have strong feelings about a 700-page book. You spent hours and hours reading this ponderous tome that requires a lot of mental investment. And then you get to the end of it and you either feel like that was a great use of your precious time on this earth, or you feel like you just got robbed. But personally, I got to the end of this 700-page vampire dark academia book, and I was just like, I don't know if I loved this book or I hated this book. But I do know that I am absolutely obsessed with it. First off, I am obsessed with the concept of a dark academia vampire book because how cool is that? Second off, I am obsessed with the idea of centering a bunch of academics as protagonists in a horror, or at least horror adjacent book, because honestly, there should be more books like that. And maybe most of all, I am obsessed with how this enormous and enormously complex book became so incredibly successful, according to Wikipedia. And you know that a book is successful when it has its own Wikipedia page. But according to Wikipedia, The Historian was the first debut novel to land at #1 on the New York Times bestseller list in its first week on sale, and as of 2005 was the fastest selling hardback debut novel in US history. The book sold more copies on its first day in print than The Da Vinci Code. 70,000 copies were sold in the first week alone. As of the middle of August 2005, the novel had already sold 915 100,000 copies in the US and had gone through 6 printings. For comparison, according to Publishers Weekly, only 10 fiction books sold more than 800,000 hardcover copies in the US in 2004. Any way you slice it, those are some impressive statistics, especially for a book that, at least to me, feels so different from the kind of book that tends to reach mainstream readers and gain mainstream blockbuster success. For example, if we take a look at some of the other books that were #1 New York Times bestsellers in 2005, the year The Historian was published, we see The Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown, The Broker by John Grisham, True Believer by Nicholas Sparks, 11 on Top by Janet Ivanovich, At First Sight also by Nicholas Sparks, and finally, S is for Silence by Sue Grafton. And by the way, I pulled these titles from the Wikipedia article that is devoted to books that were #1 New York Times bestsellers in 2005. What's cool about Wikipedia is that they actually have this for every single year. So for 2005, 2006, etc., they have dedicated pages for books that were #1 New York Times bestsellers in that year, which I honestly think is pretty cool. It's a pretty cool snapshot of what people were reading from year to year. But going back to the other New York Times bestsellers I just listed, I'm not here to comment on these books because I haven't read them, but these are famously authors who write mainstream, easy to read, highly digestible books that are obvious bestseller candidates, and which could not be more different from a complicated, convoluted, time-consuming book like The Historian. So clearly, The Historian was a very big deal when it first came out, and it kind of still is. Goodreads is not a perfect metric for anything, but it is used by a large number of readers, and I think it's definitely at least somewhat indicative of reading trends. And out of all of those 2005 bestsellers I just listed, The Historian has the second most number of people who want to read it, right behind The Da Vinci Code. And yes, I did actually go through the Goodreads pages of all of these obscure 2005 books, so you're welcome. But again, I think it all comes down to how divisive this book, The Historian, really is. If you read it, you're going to have a strong opinion about it, which means that you are probably going to want to express that opinion kind of like how I'm doing right now, which in turn creates new readers who are curious about what their reaction to this book will be, which means that we are creating this endless cycle where the historian never really leaves the conversation. And yes, I am aware that by making this episode today, I am perpetuating this cycle. Going into The Historian, I knew it was a controversial book, and I admit it, I wanted to know if I would love it or hate it. So let's discuss The Historian. Let's discuss what it's about, how it came to be, why it was and continues to be so divisive, and most importantly, let's discuss my thoughts on this book. And maybe by the end of this episode, I'll have finally decided how I feel about it. Do I love it? Do I hate it? Or at the end of the day, after all that time and energy I invested into it, am I just neutral about it? Let's find out. And I will begin the journey that is today's episode by explaining what The Historian is actually about. I've described The Historian as a vampire dark academia book, and for the most part, that's pretty accurate. The book opens in 1970s Amsterdam with our point of view character being the teenage daughter of an American diplomat. One day, she's at the library, and suddenly she discovers on her desk this mysterious old book. So she opens it up, and every single page in this book is blank, except for the 2 center pages. If you open this book up, right to its center, you have this enormous wood carving of a dragon stamped across it, and right underneath the dragon, you see the word Dracula. Obviously, our protagonist is kind of weirded out by this, and she tells her father, and her father proceeds to freak out because when he was a PhD student decades earlier, he also discovered the same book. Well, not exactly the same book, but a copy of the same book. And the reason her father is freaking out is not just because this is a very unlikely coincidence, but the reason he's freaking out is because when he was a history PhD student and he found this book, he actually started researching the historical figure who inspired the character of Dracula in Bram Stoker's novel. And as a result of his research, he actually came to the conclusion that Bram Stoker's book, Dracula, is actually closer to nonfiction than fiction. Because, get this, her father discovered that the historical figure Dracula is actually an undead vampire who still exists in the 20th century. Right off the bat, we have a wacky premise, a very interesting plot, but now let's talk a little bit about its structure, because I have called The Historian big and complex and ponderous and time-consuming, and a book that requires a lot of mental investment. And the main reason I've described it that way is because of its structure. How do I even begin to explain how this book is structured? Okay, so you know how a lot of historical fiction books like to use a dual timeline structure that alternates between the past and the present? You know that structure I love to complain about? Well, The Historian kind of begins with that structure. We have the daughter narrating the present day timeline, and then we have a past timeline as well, because her father is telling her stories about his past. But very quickly, this relatively straightforward structure devolves into this incredibly complex labyrinth that mixes media, goes back and forth in time, uses multiple narrators, and basically requires constant attention to understand where in the timeline we are and who is talking and what is going on. But despite how unwieldy its narrative structure can get, The Historian is actually not that confusing to read. And here's why. No matter what shenanigans the author is pulling on us right now, the question we're exploring is always the same. Where is Dracula? What is Dracula? And what are his motives? And since every character attempting to find the answers is a historian, most of the book is taken up by research. We go to libraries and universities and monasteries. We visit cities of historical significance. We read documents and books and manuscripts. And just in general, the author really likes conveying this message that just because you spend your life reading and researching doesn't mean that you can't suddenly be swept up in a dramatic, life-changing adventure, which is a message that I appreciate. So, that's what The Historian is about, and I think we can all agree that it has a pretty unique premise and also a very unique execution. And something interesting about the premise is that it is actually inspired by the author's life. Let's rewind all the way back to 2005 and revisit an interview that author Elizabeth Kostova did with The Independent in August of that year. The American novelist Elizabeth Kostova knew that she had hit upon a fresh way to retell the story of Dracula when a childhood memory shot a shiver up her spine. A decade ago, before she began writing The Historian, she remembered the journeys that she took through Europe as a child. In each new city, her father, a professor of urban planning, would amuse her with a story about the world's most famous vampire. I wondered whether this would make a good structure for a novel, Kostova tells me, wide-eyed from jet lag, at the Bloomsbury Hotel where she's staying for her British publication. At the end of each of these tales, the young listener realizes that Dracula himself is listening to the story. Then I got the chills and immediately began working on the book. But what we also learn from this interview is that it took the author 10 years and a lot of research to write The Historian. And I feel like if you read the book, both of those facts are incredibly obvious because this book is so long and so complex and such an interesting blend of historical fact and fiction. And that's what made me so curious about the real world context of this book. The fact that in many ways, The Historian feels so grounded. I mean, yes, there is the whole Dracula hunting thing, but putting that aside for a minute, so much of this book is about real things, real phenomena, real history. The Historian delves into historical conflicts that have shaped modern Europe and the ramifications that still echo down the centuries. It also discusses how religious institutions and practices have evolved over the centuries. It explores life in Cold War Europe. It delves deeply into the various phases of the real-life Dracula's life. It follows several historians over the course of their careers. It explores many European and European-adjacent cities over various decades, and it does all of this at a very slow pace and in very rich detail, because this is a 700-page book and we gotta fill up that page space somehow. And as a result, the historian becomes this giant interwoven tapestry of fact and fiction, myth and history, the personal and the political, the individual and the historical, that despite being obviously fictional, evil, blood-sucking vampires. But despite being obviously fictional, the historian still feels like it could be real. By the time you get to the end of the historian, you really do feel like the next time you go to the library, you too will find a mysterious dragon book that will send you on a Dracula hunting quest across the world. You really do feel like being a historian is not just reading dusty old books and writing papers no one cares about, but instead is this risky, cool, globe-trotting profession. You really do feel like maybe, just maybe, Dracula really is somewhere out there, hiding in an ancient crypt, plotting to take over the world. Because I think my most important takeaway from this reading experience is that The Historian is truly a book that is greater than the sum of its parts. And here is the part of the episode where I get a little bit critical, because I've said that this is a divisive book. And I think there are plenty of perfectly valid reasons why someone might dislike this book. I do have my fair share of complaints, which I've narrowed down to 3 main issues. Number 1, the characters. Number 2, the execution of the narrative structure. And number 3, the plot, or rather, the lack thereof. Issue number 1, the characters. I mentioned earlier that there are multiple point of view characters in this book, and I really wasn't kidding about that. We start out by following this teenage girl living in Amsterdam. Then we have her diplomat/historian father who tells her stories about his past. Then, within the father's stories about his past, we get letters from his PhD advisor. Then, along the way, we unearth historical documents which are written from the perspectives of these dead people. And there are also multiple side characters who tell us in great detail about their backstories. But while there are a lot of characters in this book, many of whom are point of view characters, I would argue that only 2 of them are the actual main characters, and those are the father and the daughter. And my apologies to these characters, but they're kind of boring. Well, no, not even kind of boring. They are spectacularly boring. They are impressively boring. It is truly impressive to me that you can spend 700 pages writing about these characters and still not give them a single interesting personality trait or have them do a single unexpected or surprising action. For example, let's consider the father character whose name is Paul. Now, Paul should be a really interesting character, if only because he is this proactive person who goes on adventures and interacts with lots of people, and just in general has plenty of opportunities to develop into this adventurous, interesting, well-rounded person. But of course, he doesn't. And part of this is the book's fault, and part of it is his fault. The reason I call it the book's fault is because it's hard to be an interesting character when you're not given interesting people to talk to or interact with. The Historian is one of those books where the moment a character shows up on the page, it is incredibly obvious whether they're supposed to be one of the good guys or one of the bad guys. And Paul reacts to them accordingly. If it's a good guy, he's found his new best friend and he will start spilling all of his secrets, even if that doesn't seem to be a smart idea. And if it's a bad guy, they will immediately try to kill him. Nuance and subtlety are just not things that exist in this book, at least when it comes to the characters. But you know what? That's really not Paul's fault. However, what is Paul's fault, and the biggest problem with Paul as a character, is that he just doesn't make a lot of sense. For example, consider the question of motivation. A character's motivations tend to be established right up front, because if you know a character's motivations, then you know what they want and what they're trying to accomplish, which tells you a lot about who they are. Motivation is perhaps the most important storytelling tool, because when two characters meet, the tone of their interaction is going to primarily be determined by whether their motivations are compatible or in opposition. Not to mention that, generally speaking, a protagonist's story starts with them finding a new motivation and acting on it. But now, let's consider Paul's motivations. He starts out with just one motivation, which is to rescue his PhD advisor, Professor Rossi. Because soon after Paul finds that mysterious dragon book that kickstarts his quest, he goes to his PhD advisor, who tells him that coincidentally, when he was a student, he also received a copy of the same book. The night of this conversation, Professor Rossi disappears, and Paul decides that he will do everything he can to find his advisor and save him. But my question is, why? Why this level of commitment for your PhD advisor? Not to sound unfeeling, but if my academic advisor mysteriously disappeared one day and I thought that it was maybe my fault, yeah, I would feel bad and probably guilty, and I would try to do what I could to find my missing advisor. But here is what I would not do. I would not abandon my PhD studies and drain my meager savings to follow my advisor around the world, especially if that meant going behind the Iron Curtain in the 1950s multiple times, and especially not if it meant I was being pursued by evil, blood-sucking vampires. Maybe this makes me a bad person, but I wouldn't do that, and I'm willing to bet that the vast majority of people would also make the same choice. I think that Paul's devotion to his PhD advisor only makes sense if there was some kind of other connection between him and Professor Rossi. If they were father and son or uncle and nephew, then it would make sense. If they were cousins or brothers or lovers, then yeah, this motivation makes sense. But Professor Rossi is just Paul's academic advisor, and that's it. Every single time Paul almost died or almost became the undead or ran up against a seemingly insurmountable obstacle, I was just like, I don't understand what's going on here. I don't understand why you are feeling more determined than ever to rescue this guy. You did what you could. You went above and beyond. So why are you still risking your life for this man that you met maybe a year ago? Paul doesn't feel like a real person. He feels like this little puppet that is being shoved around by the story and doesn't have any thoughts or personality of his own. And don't even get me started on Paul's daughter, who doesn't have a name, so I'm just gonna call her the daughter character. In contrast to Paul, the daughter character does have a motivation that makes sense, because when she goes on her multi-country adventure to search for a missing person, that missing person is her father. So, again, that makes sense. However, the main problem with the daughter character is that she just doesn't have much to do in the story. At the beginning, she's just listening to her dad's stories and doing a little bit of research into Dracula on the side. And then when she finally gets to go on her own adventure, it's just not on the same level of complexity or adventure as her dad's. I know I complained that the characters Paul meets aren't particularly nuanced or subtle, but at least he does get to meet a wide variety of characters with a wide variety of backstories, because his daughter meets maybe 2 people and she develops a connection with only one of them, while again, Paul develops deep and lasting relationships with basically everyone he meets. Paul is pushed around by the story, it's true, but at least he gets the opportunity to meet people and do things. The daughter character never even gets that. And what makes me so annoyed is that it would have been so easy to give her more depth with just one minor change. You don't need to create more characters for her to meet. You don't need to give her more exciting adventures or more places to go. No, you just need to make one change, and that is to focus more on her relationship with her father. There is so much potential for conflict in this relationship because, let's be honest, Paul and his daughter don't treat each other that well. Paul has overprotective tendencies, which his daughter understandably chafes against because she's like 16, 17, she's almost grown up, right? Paul's daughter, on the other hand, has continually lied to him in order to get around his overprotectiveness, which you might imagine he would be upset about. Oh, And have I mentioned that Paul has been hiding this huge part of his past for her entire life, including the parts of his past that directly affect her? I can imagine that fact in particular might introduce some conflicted feelings into this parent-child relationship. I could imagine that all of these complexities could lead to tension, arguments, character development. But that's not what we get, and you know what? It's not entirely the daughter character's fault. The daughter character never really gets a fair shot at developing into a well-rounded, interesting person. And that largely comes down to issue number 2. Issue number 2, the execution of the narrative structure. I've already explained how convoluted and unwieldy the narrative structure of this book can get. But what I haven't mentioned is how much the execution of this structure affects the pacing. And when you have a 700-page book, pacing becomes maybe the most important element. And also, it becomes the most difficult element to pull off well. In The Historian, we basically have 3 main narratives. Narrative number 1 is the daughter character story, which opens the book and serves as the overall framing device for the story. Then we have narrative number 2, which is her father Paul's backstory. And then finally, narrative number 3, Paul's academic advisor, Professor Rossi's backstory. A lot of historical fiction books would handle these narratives in a fairly straightforward way, with a chapter following the daughter character and a chapter following Paul, and then a chapter following Rossi, rinse and repeat for 700 pages. But in The Historian, these narratives are not conveyed in any kind of linear way. Instead, these 3 narratives interweave and disconnect, and then eventually loop back around to each other. And the fundamental issue with this convoluted mess of a narrative structure is that around the halfway point of this book, you come to realize that there is only one narrative that the author actually cares about, and that is Paul's narrative. Around the halfway point, when Paul's daughter finally sets out on her quest to find him, the book stops pretending to even be interested in anything else. And we just get chapter after chapter after chapter about Paul and his adventures. And his daughter basically disappears from the story, except for these very occasional, very short chapters. I'm talking like 1 to 2 page chapters that are just kind of like, oh yeah, and now she's in this town. Yay, daughter update. Let's get back to Paul. And by the time you get to the end of the book, you do kind of have to ask, well, if Paul is the real main character, if the most time and effort and focus is being put on his story, then what was the point of all of the other narratives? And in particular, what was the point in including his daughter's narrative? Because having read all 700 pages of The Historian, I'm really not sure that the daughter adds all that much to the overall story, especially given that she is never given enough page space to fully develop into an actual human being rather than yet another framing device. I do understand that the narrative structure of The Historian is a feature, not a bug. And I do actually really like the idea of including all of these mixed media and all of these perspectives. I really do like it in theory, but in execution, I feel like the way it was executed really ends up affecting both the pacing and also the character development. And then finally, issue number 3, the plot, or rather, the lack thereof. Now, you wouldn't think that trying to hunt down Dracula while being pursued by his bloodthirsty minions could be underwhelming. But plot-wise, that was definitely my reaction after finishing The Historian. As a supernatural adventure, as a mystery, as a slow burn thriller, yeah, I gotta say it, The Historian was ultimately underwhelming. This book does do a good job of building suspense throughout the story by introducing a lot of threats, both supernatural and also realistic. On the supernatural side, we have the characters being stalked and attacked by vampires, and then on the more realistic side of things, the characters have to navigate Cold War Europe, which is a volatile and scary thing to do. But this is not a 700-page action-adventure thriller with danger around every corner, which, don't get me wrong, is a good thing, because that would be exhausting to read. However, we still can't ignore the fact that most of this book is not what you would call exciting. We have a whole lot of historical research and in-depth descriptions of famous cities and long lists of what the characters eat for every meal, and these very long backstories and monologues from people who are good and helpful, and these short, punchy interactions with characters who are bad and evil. And at some point in the book, you do start wondering if the suspense is going to pay off, because you get closer and closer to the end of the book and you keep expecting some kind of big climax that will bring all of the threads of the story and all of the characters together. Yeah, no, that never really happens. You get to the end of the book and you're like, wait, that's it? That is the big showdown I read 700 pages to get to? But bear with me for just a little longer. Here is what I find really, really cool about The Historian and the reason that I am still obsessed with it. All of those issues I've just laid out and discussed, those issues are also the exact same things that make this book so compelling. And just hold on for a moment while I explain what I mean by that. Let's revisit the 3 issues I just discussed. Issue number 1, the characters. Yes, the characters leave a lot to be desired in their development, or rather, the lack thereof. But here's a counter argument to that, which is maybe this lack of character development is actually an intentional choice. And to demonstrate what I mean, let me pull out a couple of my favorite quotes from The Historian. Here's quote number 1. A week ago, I'd been a normal American graduate student, content in my discontent with my work, enjoying deep down a sense of the prosperity and moral high ground of my culture, even while I pretended to question it and everything else. And here's quote number 2. It is a fact that we historians are interested in what is partly a reflection of ourselves, perhaps a part of ourselves we would rather not examine except through the medium of scholarship. It is also true that as we steep ourselves in our interests, they become more and more a part of us. Visiting an American university, not mine, several years after this, I was introduced to one of the first of the great American historians of Nazi Germany. He lived in a comfortable house at the edge of campus, where he collected not only books on his topic, but also the official china of the Third Reich. His dogs, 2 enormous German shepherds, patrolled the front yard day and night over drinks with other faculty members in his living room. He told me in no uncertain terms how he despised Hitler's crimes and wanted to expose them in the greatest possible detail to the civilized world. I left the party early, walking carefully past those big dogs, unable to shake my revulsion. These 2 quotes alone demonstrate a strong insight into human nature that clearly could have been directed towards creating some really interesting, fleshed out characters. But there are a couple of other considerations at play here. Number 1, on a thematic level, I think that maybe this author is just not that interested in humanity on the individual level, and maybe instead is more interested in humanity writ large. You know, big questions of life and death, morality and immorality, right and wrong, rather than smaller scale, more granular questions like, is this individual person truly right or wrong, truly good or bad? But also, number 2, on a story level, I think that the protagonists, Paul and his daughter in particular, are designed as self-insert characters. If we return for a moment to the premise of this book, the essential conceit is that in this world, right, some historians randomly receive dragon books, which will trigger a Dracula hunting quest, complete with progressively harder bosses and side quests, and of course, an infamous final boss. And if you're picking up on the video game metaphors, that's intentional, because the historian is not really about the protagonists. The historian is about history. It's about Dracula, both as a historical figure and also as a myth. And it is about academia, and it is about famous cities, and it is about cultures and cultural differences, and it's about those big, hard to grasp concepts like sacrifice and redemption and ambition. But it's not really about Professor Rossi or Paul or his daughter. Instead, it's about generic people that you can self-insert into as they go on their life-changing, world-shaking, epic vampire hunting quests. Because who wouldn't want to think that they would also be adventurous and courageous and cool enough to hunt down Dracula? Who wouldn't want to think that they would sacrifice anything, even themselves, to rescue their loved ones from the undead? And then finally, issue number 3, the plot, or rather the lack thereof. To present a counter argument to this issue, I want to bring back something I said earlier about how The Historian is a book that is more than the sum of its parts. The Historian is not so much a book as it is an experience. Any 700-page book is going to be a commitment, but this particular 700-page book is convoluted and dense and forces you to pay attention. The Historian is a book whose size alone would guarantee that you're gonna spend a while getting through it. But thanks to the way it's written, it forces you to take all 700 pages slowly. It forces you to truly experience the places the characters go. It forces you to take in all of the historical research the characters unearth. It forces you to pay attention to all of the many, many, many details that the book indulges in. And by the time you reach the end of The Historian, you are fully immersed in this world that is a fascinating blend of fact and fiction. You are fully committed to the idea that Dracula really could exist out there somewhere. And most of all, you feel like this is a book where you have experienced everything. You have experienced the entire range of human emotions and experiences in 700 pages. There are a lot of nice things you can say about The Historian, and there are a lot of not so nice things you can say about The Historian. In this episode, I've hashed out all of the pros and cons I can think of, all of the things I loved and all of the things I didn't love. And honestly, I still don't know that I have a definitive answer on how I categorically feel about it. But here is what I can say very definitively. No matter how you feel about The Historian personally, I think we can all agree that it is a completely unique, monumental, very cool achievement. I was obsessed with The Historian while I was reading it, and even after finishing it, I remain obsessed because it was a phenomenon, it was an achievement, and even though it did take me a while to get through, I'm personally really glad that I read it. Obviously, given everything that I have said in this episode, I think it's clear that The Historian is not a book for everyone. However, if you like long, epic, historical adventures, if you like books that experiment with their framing and their narrative structure, if you like immersive, atmospheric, richly detailed settings, then I think that The Historian is an absolutely fascinating dark academia vampire book, perfect for reading in the fall. And I'm going to leave you with a comparison that will make no sense if you haven't read any of these books, but which I am convinced personally is the perfect way to describe The Historian. The Historian is The Goldfinch by Donna Tartt crossed with The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco. And if I had the stamina to keep talking for another 30 minutes, I would be happy to explain what I meant by that. But frankly, this episode has gotten completely out of hand, and I'm going to wrap it up here. This has been the 2 a.m. Book Review Club. Thanks so much for joining me, and I will be back next week at 2 a.m. Until then, have a great week and happy book travels.